Hey, I'm Gabriel Conroy. I'm the Environmental Management Program Coordinator here at USC. It's been a pleasure to be here for the day. I'd like for everyone to offer Susie a big clap, our fearless leader. Yes, very big clap. She's done an amazing job of getting everyone together, really kind of disparate groups and a really focused group of stakeholders that covers everything. I think it's been an excellent day. It's going to be an excellent couple of days. Today's session, this afternoon's session, we're finishing on a bang. We're talking about climate change and adaptations. And it kind of got me thinking from one of the earlier talks, I think it was Diane Oxenford's really kind of astute observation that when you're thinking about the passage and the best way to look after it, you've got to think big and you have to think small. So, we've got a relatively small catchment. We've got lots of processes within the catchment itself, but when we've got this looming spectre that comes from outside the catchment as well, which is climate change, which is right upon us. So I think it's going to be a really interesting session. Just in terms of the way we're doing business this afternoon, it's going to be slightly different to the earlier sessions in that the first three talks are thematically linked. So we're going to run them back to back and have about 10 minutes pooled question time at the end. Okay, so if everyone's okay with that, we'll proceed that way. So we're going to be starting with Gary Duffy from the Sunshine Coast Council.
Okay, so I'm here to talk to you about our coastal, our Resilient Coast, Our Future, which was the program that we've been running to deliver a coastal hazard adaptation strategy for the Sunshine Coast area. As indicated up there, it's a long-term strategy. It's about proactively managing for impacts of coastal hazards. And I've given you a description of coastal hazards there. And the important part is the second dot point, hazards. So they're coastal erosion, storm tide inundation, and inundation due to sea level rise. Okay, we at Council have a separate program running which is looking at flooding and climate change implications with regard to changing and flooding. Having said that, we recognise that there's an overlap between the two, and we have been working together to deal with those issues and recognise those issues within both pieces of work. The other thing I'd like to do is acknowledge the Department of Environment and Science and the LGAQ with regard to the QCoast program. So we were able to access funding for the work that we've been doing through QCoast. We also got guidance, and we've got review and input with regard to the processes that we've been running. So we've joined over 30 odd other councils. I think there's a whole 54 or something or other projects I saw the other day are currently running that local governments are doing across Queensland, looking at climate change adaptation in the coastal context. Okay, so this is a standard methodology. So this is the QCoast methodology that we've been following to deliver our process. As you can see, it's an 8-phase process. Basically, at the start of 2019, we kicked off phase 3, and then we've progressed on to the point now where preparing a final version for council consideration. So we've had a fair bit of community input into that sort of process. And the big one to note there is that we've got a draft strategy, and the draft strategy has been out for public consultation. It went out in November, December last year, and it is still up on our Council Have Your Say website, including all of the information packs and those sorts of things. And I'll go back and say that again later on because it's fairly important. You can access all that information, it's all up there already. Sorry, I keep, yeah. Okay, so the whole purpose here was to deliver a combination of technical assessments and some community engagement activities to work our way through these processes and come up with a final strategy. So this is just basically highlighting some of the key technical elements. The key bits that we had to do was basically identifying the hazards. As you can see on the box on the right there, we've identified a number of key hazards, or those hazards for the present day, 2041, 2070 to 2100. So multiple planning horizons. We've looked at the different likelihoods of different events across those planning horizons. And then we've taken them down with regard to that and brought them into the risk assessment process, which is in the bottom box. So it's basically a systematic process of identifying risk. We've looked at the assets that are at risk to those particular hazards, then quantified the likelihood and the consequence of being exposed to those particular hazards. We've identified what their consequences through a tailored consequence matrix. And we've developed an adaptation framework which is basically suited to the Sunshine Coast. So again, that's a tailored adaptation matrix. One of the big things that we actually did through this process was recognise that we needed community engagement, we needed community involvement. One of the key pieces of that engagement was the Community Advisory Group, and I'd like to thank Susie, Ken and Kerry. They're three of our CAG representatives, so they've been with us on this journey for the last 2 years. They've been giving us advice, giving us directions, and we've been working through a process with those guys. In addition, they had state agency groups attached to that information sharing process. We also tried to seek out and engage with a range of special interest groups, particularly asset providers and others. We've had 3 rounds of engagement effectively. The first round basically went for 6 months. We were seeking people's input with regard to what are the key values on the Sunshine Coast. Tangible and intangible, dollar value, non-dollar value type stuff. So the important stuff is really that intangible stuff, the things that attracts people to our Sunshine Coast and our lifestyle. As you can see there, we've had quite a number of people been engaged through across our website, in face-to-face conversations, people completing the surveys. The final strategy information, the really big thing there, and I've made it bold in text, I should be flicking that on, shouldn't I? So you can actually get to see it. The key number there is that 2,319. That's people have actually gone onto that website and looked at the strategy document. That's a big number for something that's not a planning scheme. That's a fairly big number, and it's fairly important that we got people to have a look at that strategy. We think we've succeeded there. We've got 84 formal responses that we're currently looking at dealing with and bringing into the strategy and revising the strategy, and we're going to move forward from there. So some of the key things about the exposure that we've identified, the open coast erosion, it's been managed for quite some time, and that was evident in the findings. So the dune areas and the state EPA have created sufficient setbacks for most areas, and existing protection works in other areas are actually doing their job. We're also going to expect to see an increased exposure to some areas and assets by 2100, so we've brought in targeted planning to try and deal with that sort of issue. Okay, so we've looked at tidal areas, and again, we've got substantial tidal areas exposed to tidal area inundation. So this is the sea level rise, just sea level rise, highest astronomical tides, and seeing how they've changed. So we've got rural and built up areas that are going to become increasingly exposed by 2100. And we've identified a step change in exposure at 2041. And that also follows through into the risk assessment. Similar sorts of findings for the storm tide. Okay, so again, this step change. And the last stop point there is about notable exposure. And I'm doing it again. Somebody tell me, remind me, I've got to click on. The notable exposure again is about more frequent smaller events. So this is a big issue for council. We've got a lot of assets lying down in those low-lying coastal areas. Some of them aren't a great deal of value, but there's large numbers of them. So there's a cost to that. There's a cost to maintenance. There's a cost to replacement. And there'll be an increase in cost as you have to more frequently repair and replace as sea levels rise. Obviously, it's also reducing the life of our assets and increasing our need for a greater asset management planning process. Okay, so I've rattled through that fairly quickly, and as I've said, we've already got information on the project website, so you can go and have a look at the draft strategy itself. There's fact sheets, there's maps, there's interactive mapping is still up there showing those 1% annual exceeding probability hazard maps. So you can actually flick them on, flick them off, and look at the changes that will occur with regard to those hazard areas. And it gives you some indication of what the adaptation options were that we were looking at. The thing that I really wanted to get into is talking about this adaptation framework. As I said, there's a customised adaptation framework that we've developed for the Sunshine Coast. It's very similar to what other councils have got. There's a few differences. The framework in the draft strategy talks about council's roles and responsibilities. You will find that there's quite a bit of detail about our council's roles and responsibilities, and it's about shared responsibility with the community. It is very different to what you will see in many of the other CHAS documents that have been popping out recently. So we have explained ourselves a bit better, and we're looking to work with our community to build our resilience and to adapt to climate change. The other thing to note there is that we've got adaptation responses. There's 3 adaptation responses. One is about monitoring, maintaining and preparing. So if it's a low risk area, we don't really need to do much. We need to keep an eye on what's going on, and we're doing that. And much of that applies to many of our northern beaches and that sort of thing. If the hazard risk is moderate to high, then we're going into that mitigate. And in fact, we've got mitigate is already occurring in quite a number of areas, Mooloolaba, Maroochydore, and a range of other places as well, of varying types. Some of them very hard structures, some of them are bag walls. And then if the hazard risk becomes too high, then we're looking to do this transition, to transition the land use, to transition the use that's actually sitting within that exposure area. And the other one I've got a point on is the far side there, where you can see that we've actually blended, and we've said that we're actually going to blend this mitigation transition, because we know that we need to have some sort of process in place. And it's going to take us a while to do any sort of transition. It's going to take us a while to have those conversations with the community about why you'd want to do that in the first place. So we've allowed ourselves some time to bring those sorts of things and to actually deal with those as we move forward. Okay. Next one is simply about the adaptation or interpreting adaptation pathways. So what you will find is that you've got a table, mitigation, mitigation, mitigation. So for Oxley Street to Beatty Street, what we're finding is that we've got a fairly consistent theme is that we're mitigating the risk. We will need to manage the risk. We're not seeing the risk get too high that we need a transition. It's not low enough that we just do some sort of monitoring. And you'll see that it lists in detail the adaptation options. So this is documented in the draft strategy already. It's already in there. This is the list of actual localities that we've identified in the strategy that relate to the Pumice-Stone Passage. And the things to note here, open coast erosion lines, they're on the ocean side of Bribie Island. They don't come inside the passage. It's not open coast. It's part of an estuary. Okay, so Bribie Island, our position with regard to Bribie Island is consistent with our policy frameworks. Let natural processes occur. We're not going to do anything on the northern end of Bribie Island as part of Ramsar Wetlands. There's Moreton Bay Marine Park. It's National Park. We're not going to be going into that place. Having said that, we know about accelerated sea level rise, so we can think about what is the sea level rise attached to our 2040 scenario and bring that forward, or we can bring it forward to 2070, and everything shifts forward. We then go and relook at the issue and reinvigorate. Bribie Island breakthrough, we know from the modelling that was done, we've got a rough idea that we're looking at about 200 millimetres of increase in water level, depending on where that breakthrough occurs within the passage. So potentially we're bringing our 2040 scenario into play earlier than we planned, but that's what our thinking was, to actually have a plan in place for dealing with that sort of situation. And obviously there's key things here about dealing with ecosystems and recognising that there are natural values that need to be protected. There are a raft of actions at a regional level which deal with those sorts of things. There are also very specific adaptation pathways identified. And towards implementation, we've just started this process. So the reality is we need to work with you people and move forward by working with community to deliver these outcomes. And this isn't a short-term thing that we're going to deal with. It's got to be a long-term, it's got to be a long-term commitment. And you can see all of those on the slides. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Scott.